This week on Off the Air, Connell McShane.
Welcome to this week's Off the Air podcast. It is our pleasure to welcome this week's guest, WFUV alum. He's been with the Fox Business Network since 2007, currently the anchor of After the Bell. You can catch him on weekdays between 4 and 5 p.m. Connell McShane. Connell, welcome to you Off the Air.
Thank you. This is a nice little setup. Come a long way at FUV.
And we appreciate having you here. And let's get right into it, Connell. Take us back to being a senior in high school and thinking about the process of where you were going to go to college. What ultimately made you make that decision to come to Fordham University?
Well, it's funny. I was, I look at a number of state schools and a couple of other schools in the area in the Northeast. And when I visited Fordham, I kind of fell in love with the campus. And I'd always wanted to do some level of broadcasting when I was growing up. I was the turn the sound down on the baseball game guy, or sometimes on the Nintendo and announce the video games, to try to be the announcer. But what's funny about it is when I was in high school and even my freshman year in Fordham, it wasn't something that I focused on I didn't think it was a realistic profession, quite frankly, and that was a mistake. But I got very lucky because I chose Fordham because I loved the school and loved the campus. And then about halfway through my sophomore year, we got a voicemail in our dorm room back at the time looking for people to volunteer at the radio station. And that's kind of how I got started to get to FUV, where you guys are, and start working with the guys there in, I guess, 1998. But before that, it was really the school itself, the campus. I'm from New York. I grew up, I was born in Queens, and I grew up in Long Island. And then I kind of wanted to stay semi-local, but also be away from home. And Fordham fit that. And, I love the area. I love the feel of it. So it was the school first, and then all of this stuff came after.
So you get the voicemail, you get into the halls of WFUV, and when was it that you realized, okay, this is something that I really like to do, and I think I could do this professionally?
Yeah, that was day one. And I immediately thought to myself, man, I should have done this right away. I should have done this as soon as I walked on campus. A guy named Mike Maffei left the voicemail. He was the sports manager, the student sports manager at the time. He's a year older than I am. And then they had just brought in a terrific guy who everybody over the last 20 years at WFUV looks up to, and Bob Aarons, to run the sports department and make it a more professional environment, which was actually somewhat controversial at the time because some of the older alums had been used to the students having all the power and whatnot. But Bob came in and just was the ultimate teacher and mentor for all of us. So I walked in on that first day and met a guy actually who was a freshman at the time, who everybody knows now, and he's a good friend of mine, and Tony Reale. And the two of us started there on day one together with a couple of other people. We had a pretty small cohort of guys and a few girls at the time, because FUV didn't have the numbers that it has today. A lot of that was built up by Bob Aarons over those first few years. And so we started on day one, and one of the first things we started working on was a documentary on Jackie Robinson, because it was the 50th anniversary of his first game in Major League Baseball. And, Bob being a native of Brooklyn and having been around then when Jackie came up with the Dodgers, was so into it and taught us so much about the history. But we went out, we worked on that documentary, interviewing some players from baseball's old Negro leagues, the likes of Buck O'Neill. It was just an unbelievable learning experience for young people just getting started in the business, because we learned about the history of the country, learned about the history of sports and baseball, and also learned about how to put together a professional radio documentary at the very beginning of our careers. And at some point in the future, it ended up getting archived in the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, that documentary. And just to be part of putting it together, most of my work, I think, was producing it, maybe a little bit on air, but most of it was producing the documentary. That kind of got us started. So, to answer your question, was right away, as soon as we got into that, you kind of get the bug and you're like, man, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to be on the air. I want to tell stories, want to describe events. And, one thing led to another. And here we are today, I guess.
Yeah, and in your career, you've been on air hundreds and hundreds of times. But can you just remember your first few times being on air, whether it was a sports cast or doing the one-on-one show on Saturday or play-by-play color commentary? Can you just take us into your first few times being on air and how you were feeling and trying to transition and adjust?
Yeah, the thing about FUV, you guys know this, is that you're working with pros from the beginning, and you're not a pro, and you're just getting started, and then nobody is necessarily quote unquote good at this when they start. You might think you are, but you develop over time. So I remember one of the first things I did was go down to Yankee Stadium and cover whatever game was going on. It may have been a big Yankee down the stretch game or playoff game, whatever it was. And that was one of the things that WFUV provided us, was this access to cover professional sporting events. And I went to the game and I was all excited, and I put together a big package to come on. And I went back to the station and I was going to put it on, not on one-on-one at the time, which wasn't quite as intimidating because we were working with all students, but on the radio station. And I was working, so nervous. I don't even remember whether it was Meg Griffin, who was one of the famous DJs in New York, who had come to WFUV, just a terrific woman, or it may have been Darren DeVivo or Corny O'Connell or somebody like that. And to sit down in the station and start to put it on, I thought I was all ready. Well, as soon as I went on, I lost my breath. You can't get your breath right away. And they covered for me and gave me a few minutes to catch my breath. And I eventually got through it. But you're nervous when you start. You're not good when you start. But there, you kind of have to step up your game. And that was what FUV, it's kind of a sink or swim environment once you get going. And I did after that. And you get some confidence and some things go well. You start to get your feet under you, but it can be both intimidating and challenging to work, I think, in an environment like that when you start. But of course, I think the biggest memories from being there are the personal friendships. I brought up Tony earlier, but working with guys like him and Spiro Ditas and Darwin Zook and Andrew Bogish and people like that came after me by a few years. We traveled around like you guys do to the games and had a lot of fun, on the road with the Fordham football games, even though I think maybe they won a combined one game in the 2 years that I was broadcasting the play-by-play. I may have been bad luck. But the basketball games at the time and being close to the team and going to some of the big arenas and broadcasting a game from Madison Square Garden and things like that you never thought you would do growing up, especially here in New York. That was a real thrill in college. But at the end of it, looking back at it and remembering it now, I think it's those friendships, those personal relationships, the laughs we had off the air, having a joke at Bob's expense, for example, which we always seem to do, that kind of thing you remember down the line or looking back. It's almost like a fraternity. Fordham doesn't have fraternities, but FUV became almost like that for many of us, I think.
You mentioned Tony, you mentioned Spiro Ditas and some of the other cast of characters that were there alongside you back when you were at Fordham. How do you think that working with them, of course, your personal friendships and all those things being important, how do you think working with them helped you professionally and helped make you better?
Well, I'm going to tell you the other way around. See, I'm older than all those guys. I'm a year older than Tony. I'm 2 years older than Spiro. So I've reminded them many times that I taught them almost everything that they know, and they owe most of their success, if not all of it, to me. No, it's we fed off each other, and so everybody brings different things to the table. Tony's an encyclopedia of knowledge. That's why he became a stat boy, but he's also just a funny guy, and he's not afraid to be himself on the air, which I think is why he's become such a favorite of people over the years on ESPN. He's Tony. He's himself. If you look what he puts on Twitter, he lays it all out there, things that he feels about his family, for example, or social issues, whatever it may be. He's a true, genuine person. And I think when you are that, it shines through. It comes through on the air. And that's the old saying, the old people used to say. I mean, I interned, for example, speaking of Fordham, for Michael Kay and John Sterling, but Michael Kay being the Fordham connection with the Yankees in the radio booth years ago. And Michael used to tell me that you'd always ask people that are older than you, what's your advice? And he'd just say, hey, listen, just be yourself. And at the time, you're like, okay, I'd like something a little more specific than that. But when you realize that it comes down to it, we can all learn the mechanics of any job, whether it's broadcasting or something else. But this idea in our profession of people connecting with you on a personal level is something that makes it kind of unique. And I think, Tony does that. And those other guys, Spiro just has these these pipes that he was gifted with, and he's very, very talented in terms of describing events, the cadence, and the way that he paints a word picture. He's a very, very talented broadcaster. And the other thing that he does very well is he can, and this maybe helps him in covering the Milwaukee Bucks, he can hold a full conversation in Greek. I don't know if you ever heard him speak Greek, but his parents own a diner out in New Jersey, and many times he'd be in the WFUV newsroom holding what I think was an argument with someone in Greek. So if it ever comes down to it with Giannis, although I think according to Spiro, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, he's your guy on the Greek side of things. But those guys were fun. We had a lot of fun on the road back then with Fordham, even though the teams weren't winning as much.
Yeah, and you began in sports broadcasting, but ultimately you carved your career path at the Fox Business News Network, the Fox Business Network.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Just when it comes to FUV, did you ever work with the news division as well, or was it? When was the first time that you thought that you could work in both sports and news?
Well, I did at FUV work in conjunction with the news department. Like Eileen Palmer, who's at News 12 right now, was kind of the news anchor when I was doing the sports at the time. And, so yeah, we worked in conjunction, but I did all sports in college and thought that would be my career path in, whatever, professional life as well. But sometimes circumstance takes over there. And I always had an interest in the world and following, events, whether it be political or just regular general news events, not so much business news, that came later. But my first job out of college was at Bloomberg, and I was working as a desk assistant at Bloomberg Radio at the time. And I'd always been thinking, well, let me first get on the air, then maybe I'll see if they can give me some opportunities in sports. Maybe I'll transition back to sports, which I came close to doing a few times at various places over the years. But what happened was, once you get going in something, you kind of start to like that. It's the same way I was talking about it with sports, and you start to get into what you're covering, whether it's a good event. In some cases, in my early career, an event that was very, very tough to cover, and that was 9/11. So I think after my career started in '99, I guess I'd worked a little bit off the air as a producer, then got on the air as a reporter, and I was a local news reporter when 9/11 happened. And I always say, and I think it's at least partially true, that kind of altered my career path a little bit, in that it was obviously the most significant and important story that it covered up to that point, and really probably up until this point, and hopefully for my entire career. But once you get into that, it's almost tough to unwind and go back, and you feel like you're contributing in a way that is different than what we do in sports. That said, I've thought about it, and who knows, maybe there will be a time when I get back to doing sports a little bit as well, because I still love it. I still love the games. That's what I loved about sports. Not so much the talk shows or the post-game interviews in locker rooms. I could kind of do without some of that stuff, but I love the atmosphere of the games, which is, I think, interesting to watch it on TV now. I think it's something we're missing, the enthusiasm and energy that comes from a full arena and people getting excited about a big event. So yeah, I missed some of that stuff, but I've been fortunate in that, after Bloomberg and covering that terrible event, one thing led to another. Again, I did transition because of what Bloomberg does into more of a focus on business news. I learned a lot at Bloomberg about that part of the business. I covered the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ and various things, and eventually got a job as a reporter when Fox Business Network launched in 2007. And then again, another big event, the financial crisis in 2008. And next thing you know, you're dug in there and you're covering that. Became an anchor, got back into radio for a while and working with Imus in the Morning, which was also, that's a whole other story. You could do all the show on that one, but that was a lot of fun, and another learning experience, learning from someone that had been in the business so long. And the cast that was on that show, we learned how to have a lot of fun on the air. And that went on for a number of years before I eventually left that show and came back to Fox Business, and now doing this Closing Bell show at 4 o'clock, and also getting out to do some reporting. So the whole thing's a winding road. And I tell people sometimes it's fine to have goals. And mine sometimes are 30,000-foot ones, broad goals that I'd like to accomplish, or things that I'd like to cover, or people I'd like to interview, whatever it may be. But being too set in your ways sometimes can get in your way. So I try to take it, cheesy, but a day at a time, or at least a month at a time. And because I find that when I do get myself crazy, and this does happen from time to time, about, hey, I'm not getting where I want to be, or I'm not covering what I want to cover, that's when the most unhappy. So if you just take it as it comes and try to cover the news and do a good job a day to day, or cover the sports, I think it's a little bit easier that way. And there's always something to do in this crazy business, and it's been a good ride so far. We'll see. I have no idea what I'll do for the next 20 or 30 years.
So you get your start in sports, and I wanted to ask you how you thought that starting in sports and then transitioning to the news and the Fox business sort of helped. How did the foundation in sports help you in what you're doing today, and what the biggest difference is between covering sports way back when into your job now at Fox Sports Business?
That's a really good question, and it reminds me of a conversation I had with one of my bosses when I actually just started at Fox Business, Kevin McGee, who was running the Fox Business Network at the time. When he interviewed me, he actually said that one of the things that attracted him to me as a candidate for the job as a reporter was that he saw that I had started in sports, had done a little baseball play-by-play after the FUV stuff with the Pittsfield Mets and the New York Penn League, and obviously it had the college experience as well. So I said, why? He said, well, because the sports guys, they never, ever run out of something to say. They're never stuck. They're so used to ad-libbing or coming up with something on the fly or being, surprised or describing the unexpected, that they're never going to get shaken by something that happens on the air. And I thought that was interesting because I'd never really thought of it that way, but we have that sort of training when we start in sports. Marty Glickman was our broadcast coach. Was so lucky at Fordham at the time. Speaking of mentors, Bob and Marty Glickman was really one of the more maybe one of the more influential or one of the most important broadcasters, certainly in New York sports history, if not in sports history overall. But one of the things he did a lot of things with us, but one of the things that he did with us early on to get us to learn how to broadcast, he would say that when you're driving around or you're walking around, mainly driving, and he would even suggest do this only by yourself, to describe everything you see. So if you're in the car going down the Long Island Expressway, I'm driving now at 54 miles an hour as I move on the left lane. My right indicator is on as I move now from left to right. A gray Ford Taurus has just cut me off. A woman smoking a cigarette now, driving, and we would go on like that. You'd be like a lunatic doing it. But Marty said that would make you better as a broadcaster. It actually did. Because you'd learn how to describe things in such detail, and also always keep the conversation going as you were going down the road. So it would never be just a car cuts me up. What kind of car? So that brought us back to the broadcast of the football game that weekend when we come back for the review and the critique, and it was never a beautiful catch by so-and-so. It was, what does a beautiful catch look like? Marty would say. And it was his right hand outstretched as he reached over the end line and pulled the ball back to his chest, or, that type of thing. So you would learn how to describe things in detail. And I think that kind of training does apply to any kind of broadcasting. And I mentioned 9/11 earlier, but there've been so many other situations, whether it be a protest, for example, or a political convention or whatever, some kind of high energy event where things are changing on the fly, or just anchoring in the studio and breaking news happens, something that you hadn't prepared for. That I think that sports training actually comes in very, very handy to this day, quite frankly.
And Connell, something that we hear all of our FUV alumni mention is the fact that the experience, that professional environment, prepares them for the next phase in their profession. Did you feel like that coming out of Fordham and getting your first job? Did you feel like you were just more prepared than others who are also coming in around the same time as you?
100% I did. And it really gives you a leg up. I mean, Fordham, even back then, at WFUV, we had the newest technology because, we had upgraded the systems to go digital. At the time, most radio stations were, they were cutting tape, literally cutting the tape, or using carts and things like that, which I never really got that familiar with. I used them a little bit, but not as much, because Fordham had gone ahead of the game and upgraded their technology so that when I got to the professional world, the first case for me was Bloomberg Man, which was also a pretty advanced company. Some of the older people were struggling with that, whereas I knew how to edit something, for example. But I think the better way and the more important effect of having worked with professionals is that you know how to be one on day one. So we joke around, fool around, and have as much fun as anybody, but sort of professional people, sort of older people, but they know when to turn it on and turn it off, right? So that if an event happened that's serious, you know, now, all right, let's go out and cover this. Let's, you know, put the joking aside, put the kidding aside, putting the, you know, where you might be ragging on someone in the newsroom, and all of a sudden some big story breaks. Well, all right, well, now we're in our mode. So, you know, and you've seen how professionals kind of handle themselves and they know where that line is. And I think, yeah, that was helpful on day one from an execution standpoint. And then just from being familiar and comfortable, you're not as intimidated. The intimidation happens at Fordham, like I told you the story earlier, being there and kind of getting out of breath that first time at WFUV. You've already gotten that out of the way. It's, you know, like getting that first at bat for a rookie out of the way. So, all right, let me take a deep breath now. I can let my my talents take over. And it's just like playing baseball growing up. So it's the same thing for broadcasters. I think once you've done it at that level, you're not like, oh, these guys are crazy. This is very scary. These are intimidating figures. If you've worked at FUV, those are on the DJ side. You know, those are some of the best DJs in New York. They're there by choice. They want to be at WFUV because of the freedoms it allows them. And then you get student work alongside them. It's just the perfect match, I've always thought, of student involvement and kind of professional interaction. And most college radio stations, and FUV is not your normal quote unquote college radio stations, but most college radio and television stations don't have that. They're one or the other. The students are working in the background, not getting on air enough, or the students are running everything and not getting that professional guidance and experience. FUV and Fordham, they do both. And that's unique. And it's great for the students. I've always thought that.
You mentioned Bob Aarons and you mentioned Marty Glickman. How did those two figures impact your career?
It's really hard to measure. I mean, Bob started, like I said, with me and Tony and others in 1998. And it can't, you know, just for an inside baseball WFUV side of it, emphasize enough how, you know, controversial that was at the time for the station, because the students had been the station on the sports side and obviously had produced the likes of Mike Breen and Michael Kay and Bob Hoppe, you know, more recently Chris Carino and others, and that had come right before us. And some of the old timers were saying, boy, this is going to take the students out of it. And just the opposite happened. The thing about Bob is that he was one of the more unique people that I've met in my life, because once I got to know him, and he's a lot of quirks, and we had a lot of laughs over the years, like I said earlier, at his expense. But Bob cares about the people he works with more than I think anyone I've ever worked with cares about the people that they work with. And when you work with college students, that's what really matters. So I think even though he came to WFUV a little bit later in his career, it was as perfect as it was for us. It was also a perfect place for him. He gave it everything. He gave it his heart and his soul. And really, Marty is the one to thank for that, because they had a connection from earlier on. They both went to Syracuse, by the way, our big rival, right? But they both went to Syracuse. But Marty had known Bob from various professional pursuits and thought he'd be the right person, I think, for the job, and recommended him to the station. And you know, the 1-2 punch there was second to none. Now, in terms of Marty Glickman, that's one of those things where, for me at least, when you look back on it, you kind of pinch yourself and say, wow. Being able to work with someone and learn from someone like that, not a lot of people get that opportunity. He really kind of invented a lot of the ways in which sports broadcasting happens, on the radio especially. And I think with basketball, for example, the geography of the court and the way things are described that we have take for granted now, and that's mostly Marty, you know, that he had to come up with that and doing those early Nick games and describing the way people were coming up the court and what was going on in the paint, or the elbow, or the left wing, or the right wing, and underneath on the baseline, and describing it in that way seems like, well, that was easy enough, but nobody had really come up with it until Marty did. And on the football side, and his most noted broadcasts were with the Giants in the early days. He later switched over to the Jets. Pretty much the same deal, is that he invented a lot of the ways in which football is described and broadcast. Other people have taken it to the next level, I guess, or put their own spin on it. But Marty gave us just this fundamental base of understanding how to do something. And it was so simple, but so effective in that you had to describe things in detail with Marty. It wasn't good enough. It was never good enough to say that someone took the handoff and ran for 5 yards. Well, did they run left? Okay, they ran left. Well, did they run off tackle to the left? Did they make a move, slashing back to the right, tripped up at the 33-yard line, lunging forward with the left hand across the 35 at the first down marker? Now you can kind of picture it in your head. So painting that word picture was this skill that Marty had developed over the years that he passed on to us. And it's everything, for how we do our jobs. I'm sure many of the guys that are still doing play-by-play, I know Spiro would vouch for me on this one, would say that, that's what he still does and what he still thinks about. But even for someone like me who got into a different part of the business, having that base, it's almost like a foundation when you're building a house. It's something you don't have to think about. And I think it's something that you don't even realize you're doing, and it makes you unique and better as a broadcaster. So it's, there's been a lot of people, there will be in your guys' careers as well, who have an influence over you, and you kind of, Imus was one for me, obviously, and there've been others, but those two at the start, without that, I probably wouldn't really be in the business, to be honest. And it was Bob at first, and then getting to know Marty over that subsequent year or two, it was Marty after that, that really gave me the confidence. And that's what's key, I think, is that I say this all the time when people ask, what's the most important thing in this business? It ends up being confidence. And the only way, and Marty taught us this, and Bob did as well, to be confident is to be prepared. So you have to prepare first, and then you'll be confident because you're not doubting yourself. I've always, the only time I ever felt unsure of myself on the air is when I haven't been prepared for one reason or another. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe it's a news event that I'm not as familiar with, and it just broke on the show, and I'm not as sure of the event or how to pronounce a word or a name or a city. When I'm not prepared, that's when I'm not as effective. So if you're prepared, you get that confidence, and Marty instilled that in us. And then eventually that leads to the success. So that's what those two guys gave us, the foundation.
And before we get you out of here, Connell, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to reminisce and give us maybe a memorable Bob or Marty story. Can you remember any stories going back, learning from Bob and Marty? Any memorable stories come off the top of your head?
Well, Bob's a terrible driver, so that was one of the things. And I think that Tony and I, Tony Reale, we could have had our careers cut short. When I say cut short, I mean, sophomores and juniors in college cut short, because going back to our days going out to Brooklyn to work on that Jackie Robinson documentary, Bob always thought that he knew the best and fastest route to get to a location because he's a native New Yorker. He'd grown up in Brooklyn, and this was kind of before the GPS came in. So he would do things like he'd be driving in the left lane of the West Side Highway or somewhere, the FDR, and he would just suddenly realize that a shortcut was in the exit that we were literally about to pass on the right side. And without looking, he would just swerve the car to the right. And while he's doing this, he'd be talking to someone, me or Tony at the same time. He'd go, well, when we get to Brooklyn, it'll be great. We have a big interview. And there'd be a tractor trailer going by. So that was like, that was the introduction to how to drive in New York and how to not drive. By the way, it was never faster the way that he did that. Marty stuff's most for me is probably more serious. I will say this: it's not necessarily to toot my own horn, but I don't mind, I guess, doing it for that way as well. I talked earlier about confidence. When I was graduating from Fordham, I talked to Marty about what I should do, and he said, listen, and he gave me a big pep talk about how he thought I could, be professional right away. I didn't have to go away to smaller markets and this type of thing, because I was debating whether or not that was necessary. And then he went home on his typewriter. He had a typewriter, and he wrote up, I still have it, a note on Marty Glickman letterhead. And it was just 2 or 3 lines that had said, Connell is the most promising undergraduate that I've worked with in my years at Fordham. And he signed it Marty Glickman, and he sent it out. And I used to take it to every job. I think I would still take it to a job interview because it was the ultimate endorsement for me. And we'd kind of Marty and I were close. I was very close, and it was tough when he died, which was shortly after I graduated. But he was a great human being, and just a terrific American story, going back to his days of where he should have been running in the 1936 Olympics and wasn't allowed to because of his Jewish faith, and persevering through that as a terrific athlete to be a great broadcaster. But then later in life, just being as humble as he was, to be a mentor to people like me and the other students at Fordham and WFUV. But he gave me that confidence, and I still, I like to think that I have it now, largely because of him. Him and Marty and Bob are both great guys. Yeah, love those guys. But I love having a joke with Bob. They've been up until this day.
There's one other question that we like to ask all of the alums that come on our podcast. What does WFUV need to do to continue to maintain its standing as one of the premier collegiate broadcasting programs in the country?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that it comes down to people at the end of the day. So as long as there is the professional environment where students will want to go to Fordham to be at WFUV, the people will make it what it is and continue to make it what it is. But like everywhere else, I think evolution is important. And in this business, what you're doing today is part of that evolution, always staying on top of what the next big thing is. Years ago, that was, terrestrial radio. It's not anymore. So being involved in podcasts and integrating, I think, more video into the curriculum, I've always thought is important, so that when you come out of school at WFUV, you're going to have that professional pedigree. And I think that's still number one. That's a calling card. That's to say people, yeah, listen, I worked in a place where the pros have come out of, and I'm going to be ready to go on day one. You always have that. What I think the next level is, and I think the focus has to be on, is that we have to make sure that the students coming out of WFUV have the necessary versatility to survive and kind of thrive in the modern industry. So being a radio broadcaster is not enough. Having some experience in podcasting is great, but not necessarily enough. If you want to be on air, have you done work on camera? Are you comfortable on camera coming out of school? Because in other schools, they might have done a little bit more of that. And, the one-man band is kind of the way of the world now. So do you know how to produce? Do you know how to shoot video? Can you do all of the things that are necessary? Because in your first couple of jobs, at least, and I think as the industry evolves over the years, it's going to be the case for your entire career. You're not going to be able to get away with the fact of saying, well, I'm an on-air guy. I don't touch that. That I'm not going to edit. I'm not going to produce. I'm not going to write. And I think adding that element of versatility and continuing to develop that will be important, because if you couple that with the professional pedigree that people already associate with WFUV, then you'll be able to stay at the top, which is what we all hope.
He is a WFUV alum. You can catch him weekdays from 4 to 5 as co-anchor of After the Bell on the Fox Business Network. Connell McShane. Connell, appreciate you giving us some time here on Off the Air.
Of course. Thank you, guys. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Connell.